yes, it's the radical conversation between the practicing Jew, my rabbi, Rabbi Levi Cunin, and the wandering Jew, the gentleman who's speaking to you right at this very moment, Michael E. Gerber, author of the E-Myth books, Rabbi Cunin, author of his life. And here we are. So, Rabbi, speak to me.
Good morning, good morning. It's another day in this new reality that we're in that is settling in day by day and doing our utmost to keep the smile on the face and staying in positive energy. Good to see you again. It's good to be hearing from anybody and seeing anybody these days, especially with the fear that they put out there. So it's good to be back over here. It just occurred to me when you were saying the wandering Jew. I think it's more like the wondering Jew.
No. Yeah, and somebody made a typographical error in the original ad.
Maybe it wasn't an error.
Yeah,
You know?
no. Yeah, it wasn't. It wasn't.
Wonder is a fantastic movement. It really is to keep ourselves in a state of wonder of being open to the mystery is such an important part of who we are as human beings. If we are open to it, and when we are open to it, you know.
Well, the wonder is that at 83 3/4, I don't mean to be explicit, but it is 83 3/4. My birthday is on June 20th. I was born in 1936. Think about that. I was born in 1936 and completely oblivious to what was going on in the Holocaust. I have no remembrance of my family, my Jewish father, my Jewish mother. I have no memory whatsoever of being Jewish. I have no memory of them being Jewish, despite the fact that they obviously were, despite the fact that my father's mother and father came from Europe, came from Russia, came from Czechoslovakia, and I have no idea who their parents were. None. It was never discussed. It was never discussed. I was being raised. It was never discussed when we moved when we moved to California, when I was 12. Had no true experience of it, despite the fact that my younger sister reminded me just the other day that my mother and my father were instrumental in opening the temple in Santa Ana. And that's where I was bar mitzvahed, in that temple in Santa Ana. And while I know I was, hear me, every one of you, I don't remember that I was. I have a picture right here by the side of me of my bar mitzvah with my mother and my father and me in the middle and my bar mitzvah cake in front of me. I have no memory of my bar mitzvah whatsoever, but I was. And then that was the end in my mind of my Jewish relationship, that I didn't participate in being a Jew. I was never consciously committed to being a Jew. I was simply Michael Gerber doing what I did. And now I'm Michael Gerber doing what I do. And here I'm having this radical conversation with a Chabad rabbi who's been practicing Judaism from the very first day of his life. And Levi might even say, even before that, that his soul was as the Jewish people Levi was connected with, the practicing Jews Levi was connected with, lived in his soul. It's absolutely amazing to me, Levi. It's just amazing to me that I'm having this conversation with you. One part of me is and one part of me isn't. And one part of me just simply goes on, goes on, and goes on, and goes on. And I would say living a non-spiritual life. And yet here we are in this conversation because I was inspired to have it, and you were inspired to respond to it. And we said, let's do it, and we did. It seems that very day, let's do it, and we did. And here we are. So talk to us.
So first of all, it's so interesting when I hear you sharing your story in the way that you're sharing it. What I also am very present to, and I think if any one of us Jews think about this, it's very easy to get present to the degree that we could. That when you consider the fact that at the time of your bar mitzvah, that was in the immediate aftermath of the Jewish people losing 6 million of us. And the very fact that your parents did anything Jewish was a very big deal because people had a good reason to be very upset at God. I can't imagine how difficult it must have been in the struggle with having and keeping faith, having to be alive in the immediate aftermath and being surrounded by the pain and the suffering of our people, of the immigrants that came here, having lost most of their family members, little children who never got the benefit of knowing either of their parents. So to be Jewish when you were bar mitzvah was a very, very, very difficult atmosphere. I'm sure anyone could just for a moment go back to that and realize it was difficult, you know. Maybe I'm more present to it because of the lifestyle that I live in, you know, that was something. But I recall as a child, my father told me when we would go visit the old age homes to bring joy to the people there were those that were very upset at us and they would say things that were very older Jews that were derogatory towards the fact that we were wearing a yarmulke. And my father said to us, any one of them that has a number on their hand, don't ever argue with them and just give them unconditional love. So the time in which your bar mitzvah occurred was beyond descript. You can't describe the level of pain that there was then. But know this, that the fact that you know that you're Jewish, the fact that your parents know that they're Jewish, that's because the likelihood is, and this is not just a guess, you could do the research, the likelihood is that over the last 3,330 something years, your parents, your grandparents, your ancestors, every one of them were doing something similar to the way that I'm living my life. Because if they didn't, and those that didn't, their grandchildren simply floated away and never even knew that they had Jewish grandparents. So the fact that you know that, and the fact that you also know that your grandparents actually did put on the tefillin, have a mezuzah on their door, it's important to know it's actually a story that goes back all those years, unbroken, just like the story that my story. The drifting away was only recently, and for good reason. Again, the pain and the suffering of our people made it very difficult for someone to take joy in Judaism. You know, we're living at a different time today. So it's very, very present in your life. I know that even in our conversations when we first met, and I would tell you, Michael, this is right out of the Torah. And you said, I didn't know that. I never know what the Torah is. And you're reading ideas in your book and told you these are ideas right out of Kabbalah. And you're like, but the truth is you do know it. It is imprinted in your soul, on your soul. It's part of who you are. It occurred differently than it did in my life and the way that I was brought into this world. But getting present to that truth is very powerful, knowing that most of your ancestors, and this is something if I was a betting man, which we don't bet, but if I was a betting man, I would tell you that almost every single one of your ancestors, your grandmothers, your great-grandmothers, they all lit the Shabbos candles on Friday. Almost all of them shut down their everything for Shabbos on Friday at sundown. Almost every one of them. This is statistical fact. It's logic also if we just think about it. So yes, our stories, occur from a different perspective, and thank God, and I'm grateful that we get to be having this conversation now. And for whatever reason, this information comes to you at this point and stage in your life. I will remind you that one of the great sages of Jewish history, Rabbi Akiva, who was actually from converts, he actually didn't know how to read the alphabet until he was 40 years old. And he went on to become one of the greatest, perhaps the greatest Torah sage in Jewish history. So it's the more I learn and I study in mysticism, Jewish mysticism, the more I'm present to the fact that most of that which is going on, we don't know. That's just a fact. And I'm reminded of a story of a child that was with his father, and his father's driving on a highway, and on the right side there's a big train. And he says to his father, he says, "Dad, what is that?" And he says, "That's a train." He says, "What's making it go?" So he said, "If you look closely in the front of that train, there's a hook, and it's connected to the one in front of it, and the one in front of it is pulling." So he goes to the next one. He says, "What's making this one move?" And he goes on and on until he gives him the answer, until he finally gets to the very first one. He says, "Dad, what's making that one move?" He said, "Son, were you happy with my first 49 answers?" He says, "Let me off the hook on this one." So that was the new one.
You're laughing at one thing, I'm laughing at another. The thing I'm laughing at, which I just want to remind everybody who's watching us, is that the rabbi continually has a story that's related to what we're talking about. It just constantly and continuously amazes me that it reminds me of a story. It reminds me of a story. It reminds me of a story. And almost always the stories have something to do with what it reminds him about. On occasion, they have nothing to do with it. Absolutely nothing. But I forgive him for that. So
I will tell you, Michael, I will tell you that something from the Baal Shem Tov that I think everyone could relate with. The Baal Shem Tov tells us that if we get present to how we operate as human beings, we could also get present to the fact that sometimes we're in what's called immature consciousness, and sometimes we're in mature consciousness. And the distinction between the two is immature consciousness is it's very constricted, it's very filled with fear and all that. A mature consciousness is very liberating. Two people can have the exact same experience and completely different reactions because one is operating out of immature consciousness and one is operating into mature consciousness. Now, naturally, we all would love to be living our lives in mature consciousness. You have so much more joy, but it doesn't always happen. Says the Holy Baal Shem Tov that this is why the Talmud tells us that the rabbi, some great rabbi, used to tell 2 jokes before he would start teaching. Because when a person laughs, it helps them get into mature consciousness. Because when we're in a state of joy, it makes it easier to look and to get into that perspective. So
you talk about immature consciousness and mature consciousness, and my mind immediately goes to a young person and an older person. But then my mind says, no, that's not it. Because a young person can have mature consciousness, because consciousness isn't just how we think. consciousness is the totality of our being. And so I watched your son, who was just bar mitzvah Shmuli, dancing. And I watched your son, because you played it for me, I watched your son dancing at a very, very young age. I don't know how old that first video was of your...
4 years old, yeah.
How old?
I think it was like, the first one is like even younger, like 3 years old.
And I'm watching him dancing. And to me, that in retrospect, that's mature consciousness. The sheer joy of dancing, the sheer joy of expressing his vitality, the sheer joy of being connected to Hashem, because he was connected to Hashem from the very day he was born. And you might say even before that, because before that he was connected with the souls of his Jewish family. And there we are, and there it is, and there it's living and breathing and growing as the conversation you're having with your children continually goes on and goes on. And I imagine it reminds me of a story. It reminds me of a story. It reminds me of a story. And I have to know that your 9 children have heard that expression for time immemorial. It reminds me of a story. It reminds me of a story. And they would have to think, how in the world can my father remember all these stories? Now, at the same time, I might think, and this is the wandering Jews take, that you're telling the very same stories over and over and over again. And in fact, it doesn't remind you of a story at all. You just wait.
That reminds me of a story.
You've just been telling the same stories over and over and over again. And sometimes they just happen to, fortunately, be connected to what reminded you of it. So, God willing, Levi Cunin is reminded of a story. And now that reminded you of a story. But do we have the time? We're almost done. We're almost done. So tell me the story it reminds you of.
Well, I'll tell you the story. And so there's a guy that goes into prison. He got into the slammer, and he's kind of learning the ropes over there. And he walks into a room, and there's all these guys sitting around, and one of them says 252, and everybody starts laughing. And somebody else says 151, everybody starts laughing. So finally, they had no clue what was going on. He went over to one of the people. He said, "What's going on?" He said, "We've been sitting here for so long. We know the jokes in that book by heart. So instead of repeating the whole thing, we just say the number. It reminds us." So he says, "Oh, really? Wow." So he decides he's going to join in. He says 365. Nobody laughs. He says 110. Nobody laughs. So after he's gone, he goes back to the guy and says, "Why didn't anybody laugh? Were those not funny jokes?" He says, no, but you got to know how to tell a joke.
I didn't even hear that punchline. What was it?
He said, "Why was nobody laughing?" So those were they not good jokes? He said, "They were good jokes. You just have to learn how to tell a joke."
Oh my goodness. Well, ladies and gentlemen, our time's up. And we've had a wonderful day this morning. So much working inside of me that I want to share with you. And I will, I promise. But for now, let's say goodbye. Levi?
Yes, thank you again, Rabbi Michal. I always have enjoyment of spending time with you. And I also want to conclude with the most important part of being a practicing Jew is doing a mitzvah, doing an act of goodness and kindness for somebody else. Pick up the phone, make that phone call to somebody, and go find a charity, even if it's just a small amount. Take any glass in the house any glass in the house and start putting coins in there to give to someone in need. That's the way that we bring the light that we so hope and for and anticipate. Thanks for joining us. Have a great day, Michael.
Baruch Hashem. Bye-bye.